Is this working? Can everybody hear me? Yes? Good. We're just ready to get started here. If folks want to find a seat. Dawn, am I good? You can hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We also recognize that the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, whose community at Tyendinaga continues to have a strong and enduring presence in this region. We acknowledge their stewardship of this land, and we offer our respect. My name is Heather Levy. I'm here representing Save Stone Mills. As a community group, we've worked to ensure residents are informed, engaged, and able to participate meaningfully in conversations shaping the future of our region. We are truly grateful for the response this effort has received. And I want to be clear, our work does not end with the close of the public consultation. Our commitment to advocacy remains strong and unchanged. We will continue raising awareness, supporting community engagement, and taking action, including letter writing, signage, and outreach, to ensure that the community voices continue to be heard. I also want to recognize the Coalition for Better Rail, which grew in large part from our community town hall in February. What began locally has expanded into a broader effort, bringing together individuals working thoughtfully and diligently on practical and realistic solutions and next steps. The Coalition's vision is for better rail, reliable, more sustainable, and built in a way that works with communities and not against them, while helping to strengthen and grow the national economy. It reflects a commitment to Canadian solutions that improve passenger and freight rail while remaining accessible, affordable, and achievable. We are gathering at an important moment. The public consultation period has just concluded, and many are asking, what comes next? Today is part of that next step. While the project has been presented as nation-building initiative, one focused on connectivity and economic opportunity, there is also a responsibility to ensure it reflects the needs and realities of the communities it will affect. We're fortunate to have speakers today who bring knowledge, perspective, and a shared commitment to constructive dialogue. To guide us through the day, I would like to introduce Stephen Moore. He is a recently retired Queen's professor whose work focuses on sustainability and ecological economics. Please join me in welcoming Stephen. Thank you. And you need that.
Thank you, Heather. That was very nice. I'm going to try, as Heather mentioned, I'm going to try to guide you through the day. I wanted to make sure that you checked out some of the material that we have at the back. Sometimes we feel a little reluctant to stand up and have our voice known in issues like this. And that's probably the most important thing we can do. And so we've prepared a lot of material for you, and I'll go through some of that as we go through our presentation. A fairly short agenda, where ALTO is, where we are alternatives to ALTO, and the Q&A. We'll try to answer most of your questions and hear all of your comments before the day is over. As Heather mentioned, we are really the Coalition for Better Rail. We are sort of a self-organized group of volunteers who have come together to really try to champion better rail. And the whole ALTO proposal has kind of stimulated this because it is flawed in so many ways that we started thinking about what are other ways that we really could improve both freight and passenger transportation in Ontario. And this is what we support, affordable, better rail. Our commitment is to independent research-based advocacy. And I'll talk a little bit about a website called Citizen Research that Andrew and Lindsay, who have are running that have just done a remarkable job in looking at peer-reviewed research for rail projects all over the globe. And from that, we realize how flawed this ALTO proposal is, and that there are many other better ways to improve rail transportation. I'm going to ask the steering committee just to briefly stand up so you can identify them by face, and you can ask them questions or make comments to them throughout the afternoon, and they'll direct you to the right person to talk to. The first one is Sandra Cowan. Sandra, could you just briefly, and remain standing until everyone, Ted Darby, Lindsay Davidson is way in the back there. Andrew Hyatt, right over here. Heather Levy, whom you just heard from, is right there. Myself, Susan Moore over here. And Catherine Wood. Very good. So feel free to grab any of them and make your concerns known, and ask your questions of them, and they'll do their best to provide you with an answer. So what I'm going to really talk about is I'm going to need someone to advance my slide. There we are. Where ALTO is with the Cadence Consortium. And, you know, you may or may not know that there's a whole consortium of companies put together called ALTO, and they have made a proposal, which I've heard some people call the Great Wall of ALTO, through Ontario. And it is truly an incredible proposal. And I use that word incredible in the old-fashioned sense, meaning actually not credible. They have no credibility in terms of construction costs or schedules, ridership forecasts, revenue models, operating costs, risk and opportunity analysis, how the Cadence Consortium is actually going to work, who gets the money, and who pays the bills. None of this has really been sorted out yet. And so we're starting to really realize how incomplete and how flawed this proposal actually is. What we have done is, through an access to information request, is we've been able to see their staffing budget in the future. And there are two things that really seem to stick out. One was that they are budgeting for 36 communication staff and 2 scientists. So I think you can realize what we're going to hear from ALTO after the consultation. We'll hear 18 times as much PR spin as we will hear actual scientific evidence. The other part is that they have 42 people proposed on staff for land negotiations, and for that you can read expropriation. And they have 10 for environmental and regulatory issues. So we can begin to see how this might unfold if we keep quiet after the consultation period. Another thing that has happened that you probably know is that the Air Canada CEO president, Michel Rousseau, will retire by the end of September. And this may be important because Air Canada is a member of the consortium. And sometimes when a new CEO comes on board, they want to make their mark, and sometimes they want to change things. And so we'll see how this affects Air Canada's position in the consortium. This certainly does bear watching. We have heard via the grapevine and people telling us quietly that that during other consultations in other cities, some of the ALTO representatives are feeling very stressed because they can't answer people's questions. And because of the opposition that they are receiving from regular citizens like you. And we know that people are starting to ask questions. Doug Ford's position on this is very interesting. On March 9, the mayors of Kingston and South Frontenac sent him a letter and asked for the ALTO proposal to go between the 401 corridor and that there be a stop in Kingston. CTV News reported on March 16 that the Premier wants high-speed rail in that 401 corridor and maybe a stop in Kingston. On March 30, the federal Liberal government and the provincial Ontario government unveiled the Canada-Ontario Partnership to Build. And there's lots of cooperation now going back and forth. What those two governments have agreed to is development charge reductions, and so development can go ahead more quickly, that there be harmonized HST rebates for new homes. The feds are going to provide money for the Toronto Waterfront East Transit, and also for transit projects in Toronto and Hamilton. And wait for it, the last part of the agreement was that both governments would support high-speed rail. Now, you might feel discouraged about this, but it may be a good thing. It may, because now provincial MPPs are in play. Before, when we talked to them about the ALTO project, they would say, oh, well, it's a federal project. There's nothing that's not in our ballpark. Well, that's all different now. Now you can approach your MPP and also make your views known, and this may provide an additional source of leverage. So, where we are, this is really sort of, I'm going to just briefly go through some of the support because it's really been tremendous. Sandra Cowan wrote an open letter to the Napanee Beaver. This is the first paragraph. It's an excellent letter and outlines a lot of the concerns, but she didn't stop there. She went around to local businesses and she got 100 local businesses to sign on to this letter, and they were still coming in. This is the extraordinary kind of work that I think we need in order to let our views and our ideas known. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read all those businesses, but I'm just going to let them wash over you so that you know the breadth and the depth of the support that Sandra has gained and the opposition to the ALTO proposal in this community. So, lots of names. We've received a lot of press coverage. These are just some of the press coverages that we've received. And again, I'm not going to go into depth. I'm just trying to give you an idea of the broad support in opposition to this proposal. And this also brings me to what you can do. One of the most important things, I think, is for individual citizens to write letters to the editor of the local paper, whatever your local paper might be. Now, I know some of us are kind of reluctant to do that because we think, oh my gosh, I have to write a perfect letter. Well, you don't. The letter doesn't have to be perfect. It only has to be you and your opinion. And there are tables back there, and on the far table, I've prepared a list of websites. You can go to those websites, and they will help you put your concerns and your ideas and your feelings into words. There are also sample letters that you can use and you can paraphrase them and send them out to local newspapers, because it's really important for other people to know that they're not alone, that there's a whole body of individuals who are concerned about this issue, and that we keep supporting each other and pushing each other forward. We have had statements from many different kinds of stakeholders. There have been a number of organizations that have come out in opposition to this ALTO proposal. Here are the ones for agriculture and land use. There have been other ones for biology and freshwater science. There have been other organizations, conservation authorities, transportation advocacy groups, municipal and regional governments, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and democratic and accountability groups that are concerned about the provisions in Bill C-15, which changed the expropriation rules. So at this point, I'd like you to think, what about your organizations? What organizations are you a part of? Is it the Legion? Is it a snowmobile club, a curling club, a hockey group, the Lions, Rotary? If your organization isn't on the list that I just gave you, why not? This is one of the most powerful things we can do. Talk to the groups of which you are a member and ask them for a statement on this project. And you can say, you know, I really like supporting your organization, and I would like you to make some kind of statement on what you think about this proposal. That can be very powerful. And it starts with each one of us, just looking at the different organizations that we are a member of. Now, there are some that are not on here. I notice there's large organizations like Greenpeace, Ontario Nature, Canadian Wildlife Federation, the Green Party, Birds Canada. Those groups, too, should hear from us about what their members think about this proposal, and we should be asking these groups that we belong to for a statement about whether or not they think this is a reasonable thing to do. One of the websites that Andrew and Lindsay have put together in citizen research, and you don't have to necessarily memorize this URL link. It's all on a sheet of paper at the back of the table. If you want to know what political and governmental positions are, they've recorded them all right here. Just go to this site, and there's an outstanding list, a complete list of what organizational and government positions are. There are petitions. You can go to a table back here and sign petitions if you want, but there are petitions currently in the federal government website about the ALTO proposal. 4 are sponsored by Scott Reed of Lanark Frontenac that are opposed to the project, and they've gathered over 13,000 signatures. There's still one that's open, and that was sponsored by MP Mark Garrettson and of Kingston and the Islands, asking for a Kingston station if ALTO proceeds. That one has received 359 signatures. So I just thought I'd give you this. This is in case you haven't done the math in your head yet. That's a ratio of 38 to 1. But I'm telling you all of this so you know that if you are concerned, you are not alone. There is a broad spectrum of support against this proposal. The Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus, and I have not heard a lot about them prior to this, but 103 small urban and rural municipalities across Eastern Ontario, they have made a formal resolution against the ALTO proposal. There are many townships that are opposing the ALTO proposal. And again, I ask you to look at the list, and if your township is not on that list, why not? Maybe they need, and again, if your municipality isn't on this list, that might be an opportunity for you to go to your municipality and ask them to make some kind of statement. Remember, municipal elections or in October of this year. And we may find that municipal councilors are especially receptive to their constituents around this time. This is a good opportunity to do something. There's also a bit of fun along the way, depending on your point of view, I guess. This is from a Substack, which really is just a newsletter, from Melanie in Saskatchewan. And she has some really interesting, and I quite like them because they're so sarcastic, quite interesting memes on her website. So I encourage you to take a look at this. And she's quite right. I mean, the whole country is going to get the invoice, but only very few in Ontario are going to see the benefit. So really what the coalition is asking for is for you to become involved, and also for, if we want to improve rail service in Ontario and then the entire country, there are lots of different options. There are many ways to do that, some good, some not so good. But in this ALTO proposal, what we've seen is, first of all, it was assumed that a 300-kilometer-an-hour train was essential, and it's not. As our local Reeve Jean Wise says, what's your hurry? Also, they've made another assumption, and that is that we have to steer clear of the current rail system. Well, we don't. There is such a thing as intelligent project planning. Ted Darby can tell you all about this. That there is a rule book. There are certain things that you should look at when you're planning a project of any size. And the first thing that you should look at is, what problem are we trying to solve? And the first thing that we noticed was that Via Rail only owns 3% of the tracks that it runs on. That's why passenger trains spend so much time waiting on sidings for freight trains to go by, because freight trains have the right of way. And that's what pays the bills. So the first obvious area to look at is splitting passenger and freight and giving each one their own line to run on. Then you can have reliable, frequent, good Via Rail service at a fraction of the cost of the ALTO proposal. Another thing that you want to think about is, what resources do we have? In Andrew's research, the average cost overrun in a project of this size is 44.7%, which brings us up to over $100 billion for high-speed rail. What could $100 billion pay for? Anyone in here have trouble finding a family doctor? Anyone in here worried about housing, worried about the cost of food, worried about, there are a number of things that this $100 billion could go a long way toward fixing. And probably high-speed rail should be further down the list than it is currently. Also, what is our timeline? Will this be done in our lifetimes? Will it be done in the 2040s? Will it be done in the 2050s? Are there ways that we can improve rail service within 5 or 10 years rather than decades? And what will provide the most benefit for the most people? Rather than pushing an expensive proposal that will be used by a relatively few number of people, but will hurt many, why not just turn that around? How can we do something about rail travel in Ontario that would benefit the many rather than the few? So, with that little bit of a preamble, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Wood to do our first presentation. Catherine is the president and CEO of Pivotal Momentum. She has created a small business success workbook She's a coordinator or a co-founder of Wood and Wood Communications, and also a coach, a facilitator, a trainer, a project manager, and best of all, a clear thinker, I think. And I turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you.
There's a clip there.
Yep, should go on.
Hold it out here.
That's okay, I'm left-handed.
Oh.
Oh, look at that. Thanks, Stephen. First of all, great to be back in this particular room. The last time I was here was for a euchre tournament for our hockey team. So just so you know, I grew up in Newburgh. I went to high school in Napanee, headed off to university so far away in Kingston for a couple of degrees, live in South Frontenac, and yes, I am smack dab in the middle of the southern route. But that's not really why I'm here. I also would say I played hockey for 20 years across the street, so still play. So, yeah. Some people in this room that I've played with and against over that period of time. So I have some pretty deep roots in Lennox and Addington, and certainly in Stone Mills. So what I want to talk to you about today is, see if I can make this work. Yeah, there we go, look at that. Is an alternative proposal to what's currently before us with ALTO Rail. And I'm calling this, and this is a mouthful, I know, Integrated High Performance Rail Network. That's what I'm calling it. I'm going to explain this, so don't get too worried about this. It builds on many of the things that Stephen just talked about. And I'm going to walk you through that a little bit. I'm taking a step back. I'll say two caveats that I want to mention right off the bat. One is I'm not an engineer. We have one who's going to present here in a couple of minutes. But I have been around the world of politics, economics, finance, project management long enough to be able to step back from this and say, is this actually the best solution we can come up with? And my answer to that is no. But having said that, then I believe it's incumbent on me to say, well, then what should we do? And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about, at least one idea about that. There are others, even outside of this room, there are other people making other suggestions, and I think they all should be looked at, not just what I say or what Andrew says or others. There's some very thoughtful people outside this room. So the second caveat is that we're in Ontario. And so I'm not going to spend very much time at all talking about the parts of the ALTO network or proposal that have to do with Quebec. I assume that the people of Quebec would like to speak for themselves, and just as we would like, as residents of Ontario and Eastern Ontario, to be able to speak for ourselves. So bear that in mind as I go through this. So here's in a nutshell, sort of based on what we know now, when I step back and take a look at the current proposal before us, I would want to emphasize that in its current form, because a lot of you individually and many people, many organizations have said in its current form, this proposal, or as some of you might have said in other circumstances, this dog don't hunt, okay? It just doesn't work. It is, as the illustration or the image on the screen will share with you, it is a square peg that somebody's trying to fit into a round hole, and it doesn't work. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is this is out of context for the world we're living in right now, and the priorities that presumably we are able to articulate in what kind of investment we would want to make in passenger rail in Ontario. And secondly, and this is an incredibly important part, when I look at this proposal, I don't see a lot of strategic long-term benefit for Ontario in this. And we can debate whether there's benefit for anyone else. But when you look at it, there's some serious flaws here. Thirdly, I consider this to be a pretty weak response to both existing demand for passenger rail and the long-term equivalent, because I think that's a growth industry if we handle this correctly. Fourth, because of some of the inadequacies, or at least lack of evidence that the measures have been put in place to this point, that this project would be anywhere close to budget, no matter what route is chosen, I think we can pretty much guarantee at this point it will not be within any reasonable budget that we might expect to follow. And then finally, it hasn't yet demonstrated, at least to me, that the benefits, that they've taken into account the benefits and the learning that can take place from other passenger rail projects that have taken place around the world. ALTO told me that they had when I wrote to them about this, but it basically amounts to their comment was basically, we have to do really good planning up front. Well, yeah, you do. Well, what does that look like? And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular piece of content, but I just wanted to encourage you, if you can take a look down the left-hand side, I don't know if you can even read this, but the world has changed a lot, even in the last year and a half. Is there anybody here who thinks that we're not living in a different world than we were a couple of years ago? I mean, you just have to think about the challenges that we're having trying to diversify trade with the tariff issues that are going on and international trade disruptions. We also can think about the travel patterns that have changed, the dramatic decline in the number of Canadians that are traveling for tourism purposes to the US, as an example. There's great upheaval there, but that's also reflected in Canadians going to other countries. And we can come back and talk about that, because passenger rail certainly takes that into account. I know I have many friends, and you may too, that this past summer, 2025, instead of going south, they went east. A lot of people from Toronto went east, and in many cases as far east as the Atlantic provinces, so don't think just Ontario and Quebec here. So there are a lot of changes that have been taking place. There's a lot of implications for passenger rail for that, and for freight. And so the notion that we could ask, for instance, CN to just give up track time to help us solve congestion problems for passenger rail is not a good idea, because a number of initiatives that are moving forward to diversify trade mean that there's going to be a lot more freight moving east-west than north-south. And so we want to make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to that, because we will all pay the price economically. If any of us work in or know people who work in manufacturing facilities, in agriculture, and any of the other resource industries, be careful if we ask for commitments from CN or CPKS to take some of their rail time. They need it, actually, and we need them to do a good job on that. So in this very turbulent world, what is the response that we are seeing from the point of view of passenger rail service? And I'm going to talk about this just for a moment or two from a Canadian perspective, as well as give you a couple of examples from the US. So I'm not sure how many of you know this, but the Ontario Northlander passenger rail route that was canceled in 2012, the service was canceled in 2012, is returning to service this year. I've had a high degree of confidence in that. The testing, the final testing, or burns as they call it, for the locomotives that are running, which are Venture trains, which is identical to the trains that VIA is using, the higher speed version of that. They are being tested now, and that is due to come into service. So I want you to think about why the province of Ontario, which is the provincial government that is behind this, why would they make this investment? Because they have made an investment in this. So think about that for a minute. Why would they do that? Secondly, we can take a look at the interest that there has been expressed in what's referred to as the Prairie Link Partnership, that would run a 400-kilometer-an-hour train between Calgary and Edmonton in Alberta. Okay, so there's another, now that's been on the books for a while. There was an MOU signed several years ago. Whether or not that proceeds is not my point. My point is that there's a strong interest in passenger rail service to connect those two cities in Alberta. And then thirdly, there's lots of conversation taking place, and has been for a while, in Atlantic Canada on improvements to passenger rail for Atlantic Canada. So this is actually, passenger rail is actually a national issue. I thought I felt bad for us with Via Rail being, having so many challenges with being on time. But then I realized that there is a section of Via rail service in New Brunswick that is currently the average speed that train runs at is 50 kilometers an hour. Okay, so we've got to deal with that kind of problem, I think, in this country. But from my point of view, the current proposal from ALTO is this isolated, or at least it seems to have been undertaken in isolation from all the other issues that we might want to think about when it comes to passenger rail. And then if we look south of the border, I think it can be argued that the US, which is a G7 country, does not actually have a high-speed rail service yet. I think the closest one to the 300 kilometer an hour definition that's being used for ALTO is Boston, Massachusetts, in that area, and I think it's 240 kilometers an hour. So a couple of the items that I picked out of the many that are going on globally, the first one is what's referred to as the Bright Line, Florida, connection between Miami and Orlando. That train, which is the first fully privately financed intercity rail service in the US, started in 2023, went into service then. They're already looking at an expansion to that, to bring Tampa into that. But look at the train speeds, 201 kilometers an hour. So if we take a look at Chicago-St. Louis, the high-speed corridor there that's being proposed, what they're working on are improvements that allow for Amtrak trains, which operate that service in the US, to whip along at 110 miles per hour or 177 kilometers per hour. Again, it's nowhere near 300, but they refer to this as part of their high-speed system. And the goal there is to cut travel time and enhance, and I'm quoting here, one of the nation's busiest state-funded corridors. Well, that's what our corridor is. The Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor is the busiest corridor in Canada when it comes to this. So I was looking for examples that would bear some relevance and enable us to look at this. And then the third one is the Northern Lights Express, which is kind of a cool name. It's too bad we hadn't picked that. But, it's in Minnesota. And they're proposing a new passenger connection between Minnesota, St. Paul, and Duluth. And they're going through Wisconsin, actually. They're running on rails, or they're proposing to run on rails that already are there. And what is the speed in that case? 144.8, or say 150 to 177 kilometers per hour. Again, another example of something that is not 300 kilometers an hour, but seems to be responding to real passenger demand there. In the UK, they're adding rail lines and expanding and reopening, actually, stations that had been closed previously. So there seems to be a resurgence in interest in passenger rail services. So the question is, how do we get on that train properly? So I want to take just a moment and focus a little bit on the existing VIA service, because we can say, if we want, just cancel ALTO altogether, just get rid of it. And I'm sure that many people are tempted to do that. But there are also a lot of people who are saying, well, wait a minute, what about VIA? What happens to VIA? Will that still be there for us? It's running in the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor right now. Unfortunately, it's not running very well. And I know Andrew will get into more of this, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But I just want to give you an idea of the importance of VIA in the full system, or the importance of our corridor in the full system. Basically, a little over 2 million of the passenger trips that are taken every year on VIA's entire service across the country are taking place in the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal triangle. That's about That's more than half for the entire country. So I want you to think about if an ALTO proposal came forward that essentially cannibalized that service and put some of those 2 million people, we don't really know how many, on an alternative train, how viable is the existing VIA service? Just give some thought to that. And that's a pretty important financial question for us to ask, even aside from the question of whether any of us would be able to use the ALTO service, because it's not going to stop anywhere near us. At this point, VIA does. But on the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is the total annual subsidy that comes from the taxpayers of Canada to support the existing VIA service. And so in 2019, that was about $280 million. Okay? That's annual. That's just to support operations. Doesn't do anything, has nothing to do with buying new trains. Just to support the existing operations. That spiked significantly when the pandemic hit. Not surprisingly, nobody was traveling, but you still had the same operating costs. Right? Then it dropped back down. It is now in 2024, I think that this just shows 2023. 2024 is about $385 million. $385 million of your money every year that goes to support VIA. Could it bear improvement? Yes, it could. Definitely, the current service could be improved. And the reason that this is important to think about is, as last I heard, the first quarter of 2025, on-time performance for VIA was about 30%. That means 2/3 of the time the train doesn't arrive on time, or at least on the time it was supposed to. And I know Andrew will talk about this. A big part of that challenge is that we don't, and Stephen mentioned it, VIA doesn't own the line, the rail tracks that it runs on. So they're at the behest of the freight side of things, which is important, but that's the problem we need to solve, frankly. But I also want to share with you that the significance of this and the risk to VIA, unless we handle the next few years correctly, has come to the attention of the Auditor General of Canada as recently as February of 2026. So this quote at the top of the slide, if you can read it, I'll read it for you just in case, because if you're at the back you might not. Declining punctuality increases the risk of losing passengers to other modes of transportation. Well, that's automobiles, folks. That's what it is. Threatens our revenue targets, being VIA's revenue targets, and undermines VIA's ability to meet its strategic objectives. Now, you need to know VIA's strategic objectives are set by the federal government. VIA doesn't get to do that in isolation. So this is an issue that the federal government needs to pay attention to, and we need to keep pointing to it, because if we don't, the odds are very good that VIA in its current iteration will languish and eventually be drawing so much money from the public purse that somebody's going to say, that would be my concern. So what do we do about all of this? So I want to just talk a little bit about this, what I consider to be some design criteria for better rail in our corridor particularly. I'm just thinking about Ontario now. It needs to be integrated. What does that mean? It means to be connected with other rail lines, which could be something like Metrolinx or other transit services. Other modes of transportation, so airports. I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but other methods of transportation, and with the strategic objectives of the provinces and the region. And I'm, again, here referring specifically to Ontario. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. High performance, from my point of view, and I think this emerges directly from the conversations that Tom and Sandra and I had, and that have been elaborated, amplified by others. There's 4 major pieces of that. One is operational performance. I mentioned already the on-time performance, but there are other thoughts, other issues and criteria that we might have there too. Safety is a big one. The ability to handle winter conditions. I know a number of people in this room have spoken about that. onboard amenities can you actually work on this train, however fast or slow it's going? Secondly, the financial performance, which frankly I don't think has gotten a whole lot of airtime because I know that many of us, including the folks in this room, have been much more concerned, understandably, about what's the impact on my property, on my community, on my environment. But the financial performance needs to be established at the front end. The return on investment from a taxpayer's point of view, as well as any private sector investment that might take place. Cost-effective operations. They're not cost-effective if you're not running on time and you're losing passengers. And reasonable fares, right? This has got to be affordable. I think Stephen mentioned that. Environmental performance, which I know has been a hot topic for many of us. The climate change, and the contribution that we can make to that, and simply by getting cars off the road is a really good place to start. Preservation of landscapes. I know that's a big issue for all of us in rural Ontario, and farmlands specifically is a serious issue. And there are other environmental considerations, but I'm just telling you sort of what I'm thinking about whenever I set this as an environmental or as a criteria for a high performance rail. And then in addition to that, community performance. How does the new proposal offer stations reasonably close by? Or do you have to drive for 2 hours to get on the train? Ain't going to happen, is it? And then minimum disruption to our communities, which people in this room know way more about than I even need to speak to. And then the fourth issue or criteria here is the idea of networking, which is the connectivity, yes, to other modes of travel, but also making sure that we are covering the available market. And by that I mean the number of people distributed across Ontario that could actually and would and want to ride the train. There's lots of them. And the frequency of service comes into that as well. So on the next slide here, I just want to sort of translate those criteria a little bit into what would be the foundations of a better rail service for us in Ontario, and specifically in Eastern Ontario as well. Dedicated passenger rail lines separate from the freight tracks. Now, notice I said separate from the freight tracks. I didn't say that we needed an entirely new greenfield corridor, 10 kilometers wide. There's opportunities, I think, to make use of existing corridors and be a little more creative and innovative in how we solve this problem. To go back to Ted's question that Stephen put before us in his remarks. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? So the second part of that would be shorter travel times compared to driving. That's the core issue. And it seems to me as though there's a fundamental problem with the ALTO mandate, which I believe is that the federal government asked ALTO to bring forward proposals of how they would structure or recommend building a dedicated line from Toronto to Ottawa to Montreal, and do that so that people could get from Toronto to Montreal in 3 hours. That metric or that standard was in Justin Trudeau's announcement in February 2025. So I have to think that that is a criteria that ALTO feels compelled to uphold, because they signed a contract saying they would do that. So the person or persons that are going to have to change that, if we want to take a different approach, would be the Prime Minister or the Minister of Transportation. So to keep that in mind. That is, I think, the challenge before us, is that somebody decided that that trip had to be undertaken in 3 hours. And if you go through Ottawa, you've got to have train speeds of 300 kilometers an hour or you're not going to make it. And you can't have any stops in the middle. So consider that. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions is an important one, I think. That could happen either through electrification, which is the option that's been most touted, or diesel-electric hybrid trains. That was the original proposal from VIA in at least 2017, as far back as 2017. And then, of course, there is enormous greenhouse gas reductions from just moving internal combustion engines off the 401 particularly, and having people riding on trains. And then I've listed some other attributes that a better rail system would have here. I'll just quickly go through them. Accessible to more communities across Ontario, financially responsible and sustainable for taxpayers, people in this room, reflecting citizens' priorities for limited public capital funds. I think at last count, the Major Projects Office of the federal government has $150 billion worth of major projects that they're planning to invest in. Those are the ones who have made it further than the ALTO proposal has. The ALTO proposal is just in the strategy group. There's 6 projects there, but there's 15, I think, that total up to $150 billion. And we're expecting that federal government to now find another 60 to 90 for a very narrowly defined rail service. It would not be my priority. And then the last one is better aligned. It needs to be better aligned with Ontario's strategic priorities. So I want to give you a chance to just shout out a couple of examples here. What do you think, just based on what you've been hearing over the last 6 months to a year, what do you think and what have you heard the Ontario government talking about as its priorities? Anybody want to suggest? Sorry, we're here. Well, I didn't hear that. What?
The plane.
Oh, the plane. Yeah. Yeah. He's clearly not riding the rails.
So don't get me wrong. I'm a private pilot and former aircraft owner, so I know how stupid they are.
Okay. Thank you.
You have to look not at today's other modes of transport for a comparison to the ALTO proposal. Rather, we have to look at what they may be in 25,
Fair enough.
50 years while ALTO kicks in gear.
Fair enough.
And particularly when we talk about getting cars off the 401, that would be a countercultural move. It might be better to change the what I call the point of propulsion inputs. That is electric cars.
Okay.
Autonomous electric cars, but not just cars, different size vehicles.
Okay, can we hold that for the Q&A? Because it would be great to come back to that.
I thought that's what you were asking.
No, I'm just asking what do you think the priorities are, and you answered the jet. Right?
He answered it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, my priority would be for electrification of existing
Okay.
modes.
Okay, fair enough. So what else have you heard the province of Ontario talking about in the last 6 months?
More jails.
Pipelines and critical minerals.
Critical minerals, there you go. Okay. Hand back here. I can't actually see your face. Housing, that's another good one. Any others? So we've got critical minerals, housing.
Doctors.
Healthcare? Yeah, those are pretty. Did you hear? Have you heard the province of Ontario talking about high-speed rail over the last year? No. And frankly, I consider it shocking that the province of Ontario seems to only on the 30th of March had a formal mechanism to be engaged in the ALTO project. You realize that? Where's that been? That's a little while. So I want to, so this is good. Those are good examples of where I think the province of Ontario's priorities have been, and what I have heard many of you saying when you say, we don't need ALTO, what we need is an investment in X, Y, or Z. That's mostly what you have said. So I think there's 5 opportunities to think differently on passenger rail, and I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly. But one is integrating with and connecting to other provincial transportation assets and services. Secondly, capitalizing on the Highway 401 widening that's going to be taking place through Eastern Ontario. How many people are aware of that? Yeah, okay, so some people are, yeah. Thirdly, leveraging the new Canada-Ontario Partnership to Build, which has already been referred to by Stephen. Fourth, using innovative construction and project management techniques. I'll speak to that in a moment. And then leveraging the Parks Canada pilot project in Banff National Park to protect wildlife. So those are 5 opportunities I think we have in front of us, and we'll talk just very quickly about those. There are opportunities that we have not yet pursued to connect with urban transit, with other passenger rail services, and frankly with bus services, airports, and ferries. And I just have an image here from the Melbourne Airport Rail project, which is underway now, where they are connecting their passenger rail service to their airport in Melbourne. And they're doing other things too. So they're untangling, for instance, their freight and their passenger services, because that enables them to run more efficiently. They are upgrading and adding stations. And they expect that they will have 1,000 trains. This is hard to imagine. 1,000 trains a day using that service now. I don't know how large or small those trains are, but somebody is clearly thinking big picture and how do we connect our different modes of transportation. And that's to be done by 2030. Okay? So they are quick, on the quick march for that. I have not yet heard, and if anybody here has, how ALTO proposes to connect to Toronto, a station in Toronto. It may or may not be Union Station, or Ottawa or Montreal. And to my mind, we need to have that figured out before we start designing the details of what the rest of the route looks like. Let's prove it to ourselves that we can actually get trains into those 3 big cities, because that's the only reason that this is being proposed.
May I reinforce your point?
Okay.
At the Peterborough ALTO meeting, I asked that very question about connectivity into Union Station. When one of the attendants there mentioned Union Station, he said, right now we're considering tunneling under the buildings downtown. We just don't know where we're going to pop up. I'm not making that up.
I rest my case. Well, I'll come back to that. So the second, yes?
Yeah, I heard Peterborough was saying if you dip in and southeast corner, there will be around 10,000 acres they'll consume, maybe farmland. But this is the same talk you're saying about Ontario, what they're really doing. The reason you never heard anything from Premier or anybody is because they don't want to hear from anybody. And that's why it's happening right now.
Yeah.
And I'm in here and I see everybody here, we're all going to be dead before it's built. We're the young people building the children every day. You take Highway 27 right away. Put a sign up there and say this is going to be dead end right there. That's going to be coming, that's built. And dead end going to County East, dead end going to Yardley, dead end.
Okay.
Then you do that.
Okay, let's hold that for the Q&A.
Ontario government will take responsibility. They do something.
Hold that for the Q&A.
Anybody that's talk here.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. So the second option is that we capitalize on the 401 widening and really think long and hard and do the tough work, because it is complex work, to figure out how, when we know the province is going to expand the 401 up to 8 to 10 lanes, it differs depending on what part of the area you're looking at, that's going to require a significant amount of overpass, underpass, bridge reconstruction for the north-south traffic. And how many interchanges do you think there are there? 150, at least. There's actually a couple more than that in what I call the 401 Lakeshore corridor. And I'm not just talking about the highway. I'm talking about the area in which the CN route is currently running as well. I mean, at this moment, when ALTO talks about a corridor, they refer to a 10-kilometer wide stretch. I don't think we need that much, frankly. We want to be, I believe, we want to be close enough to the 401 that when that reconstruction takes place of all those overpasses or underpasses, that we can run a rail line underneath or over that at the same time, so that we're making an investment in that part of the infrastructure at the same time as it's already going to be taking place. It has to, because they have to widen that. So when you hear, and I know you will whenever Andrew's talking to you as well, when you hear a reference to Kingston Sub, that means Kingston subdivision of the CN rail line. Okay, so it doesn't mean like a subterranean or a subway store or something like that. That's how they refer to it. There are also, the 401 corridor is already a busy corridor, the way I define it, because there's already at least 30 rail spurs for freight purposes leading off that as well. So that's why I mean it's a complex process, not to be undertaken lightly, but I think it's doable. I think if we're remotely creative, we can do that. And so I'm not suggesting, I want to be really clear on this, I'm not suggesting that we run freight or passenger services in the median of the 401. Okay, it's highly preferable for it to be on the outside of that. So let's be clear about that from the beginning. So the third opportunity is to leverage this new Canada-Ontario partnership to build, and Stephen's already said it. This automatically brings our provincial government to the table there in a very formal way, and our MPPs. Many of which in our part of Ontario are on the government side of the house. So think about that. And there were a couple of things I just wanted to highlight from that agreement that would be easy to miss. I mean, Stephen's already pointed out that the specific reference to the ALTO project in that, because when you read the headline, it says that they're going to build homes, transit, and communities. So unless you go a little deeper, you might not realize that there is a direct link to the ALTO project there, which we need to leverage. But there's also a reference there to partnerships with municipalities. And the province is the main level of government that would do that. The federal government doesn't have that direct relationship that the province has. So there's some elements of this, now knowing that there is a formal mechanism, which is, as much as anything, political as opposed to anything else. We now have, and this is actually the first time in my lifetime, maybe some of you can remember other times, when we have a provincial premier in Ontario and a federal prime minister who seem to get along. And so we should leverage that and see how we could make that work for us, and make sure that they have all the information that so many people have put together and are encouraged to think about alternative routes rather than the ones that are being proposed. I would also just say that when Premier Ford said that he would prefer the 401 route, he said a couple of other things. He prefaced that by saying he didn't want to see it going across farmland. So that may be an indication of some of the impact that you're having. But he also said maybe a stop in Kingston or a couple more, because he's looking at how many stops there are in Ontario compared to the number in Quebec. So I think there's some reason to think that he would be open to alternative suggestions on how this service could unfold. So another opportunity to think differently is using what I consider to be, or it's known in the industry as parallel construction. And that means you don't start at one end and work your way progressively through to the other end. You build in segments so that you can accelerate your construction time frame and get your service into service much more quickly. And there is a big caution on this because you better make sure that your endpoints are clearly figured out and locked down and are frozen so that they don't change by the time you get to the other end. And some people might say, well, Kathy, I don't think you can do this for high-speed rail or any other kind of passenger service, but I can tell you many other countries have done it. Japan's doing it all the time. This is the way they do it. China's done it, Italy's done it, France has done it. So this is a lesson that I would hope that ALTO and the federal government would take from the work that's been done in other places. There is another way to do this rather than just saying we're starting in Toronto or Ottawa and somewhere else and building out until we get to the other end. And I've given you an example of how I know Ontario has already done this. The picture on the right-hand side is a bridge being replaced. I think it was Island Park Drive in Ottawa in 2015. And I was fortunate enough to be in conversation with the regional director of MTO at the time, who shared with me that this was going on. And they replaced the bridge. They did all the other work, previously, and they replaced the bridge. They say it's 48 hours, and I think it might have actually been less than that, because they built the entire bridge off-site, and then at the last moment, on a weekend, when the traffic volumes would be lower, they moved it into position and fastened it into place. I believe that that technique was actually pioneered in Northern Ontario, and then MTO brought it south. I also understand that MTO has applied these kinds of techniques to highway construction in Ontario, so we are not without some capability here to do that. The most fun part for me in hearing about this bridge in Ottawa was that I understand they set up bleachers so that people living in the community who could go and sit there and watch this thing actually being put in place. And there's a time-lapse video on it. It's pretty impressive, actually. And then finally, in terms of the opportunities, we can leverage the Parks Canada pilot project to protect wildlife. Banff National Park has had some serious issues with wildlife fatalities, grizzly bears, moose, all kinds of other wildlife in the area where the CN rail runs through. And they've identified a number of things that can be done. Some of them are shockingly simple, actually, but that can dramatically reduce wildlife fatalities, as opposed to feeling that we have to build 1,000 kilometers or 2,000 kilometers worth of 12-foot or 10-foot fence across the entire corridor. I understand that there is nothing that requires railways to actually build fencing along their routes. Should it be there in more urbanized areas? Probably, because the number of fatalities, even though on average it's reasonably small across Canada, I have those numbers if you're interested, but still, in some ways, one is too many. But most of those fatalities are not at the grade level crossings. Less than a third of them are from the grade level crossings. They're from people walking across the tracks or onto the tracks. We don't want anyone to experience that, but we also don't want our wildlife to be precluded from moving back and forth. And so we can talk more about that. I'll carry on here. So my thought is that we could look at 7 corridor segments. That's what I'm going to call them, all of which I would expect to go through an environmental assessment process, and they would also all have to have a business case before any of them proceeded. They would be based on the idea of using existing corridors as much as possible, and I'd be looking at train speeds in the 160 to 200 kilometers an hour range. Station stops, which we won't have any of, and under ALTO in our region, would be assessed based on several criteria. And these are not, I didn't come up with these, although I think they're pretty good. One is that if the closest station for you is more than 80 to 100 kilometers an hour away, then there needs to be some consideration for a station stop there. The second criteria would be roughly 30 minutes travel time. There's reasons for that, which we could talk about. And then thirdly, some evidence of additional ridership and obviously revenue from that would justify taking the time to make that stop. I think that the population size would be somewhere in the range of 50,000 people in that community or in that area, and have to meet the other criteria as well. And that, if you applied that from between Montreal and Toronto, that would suggest about 5 stops in the middle. There's potential for more than that, but I think that there might be a real good case to be made for 5 stops. So what that might look like if we take a province-wide point of view, I'll just go through those. One would be a Toronto to Montreal direct line. Another would be a Toronto-Peterborough-Ottawa line. And there's a couple of different options for how that might unfold. Ottawa to Montreal, which is already sort of on the books, so to speak. Montreal to Quebec City. I'm not going to say anything more about those, although there is a part of the Ottawa-Montreal line that actually runs through Eastern Ontario and Prescott-Russell. And personally, I don't feel that they should have to sacrifice their piece of the Trans-Canada Trail for that route, but we can talk more about that at another time. The North Bay to Ottawa route, which may be would be new to pretty much everybody here, and probably new to ALTO as well. But I think there might be a good case to be made for that. So the Northlander goes to North Bay from Union Station, or yeah, it is going from Union Station. And then it goes on to Timmins and Cochrane. But who else can tell me what else is in North Bay of national significance? Anybody know?
CFB?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
The CFB there?
Yes, that's right. Was it Wing 22? But it's also where the NORAD station is, the Canadian NORAD station that controls all of the surveillance for Northern Canada. So pretty significant national asset in which some investment is going to be made. So it strikes me that we might want to take a look at whether or not a dual use or dual purpose rail service through there, both freight and on different rails, different lines, different tracks, that we would also have passenger service there. And then the Northlander that I've already talked a little bit about is already up and running, essentially. Will be within months, I guess, before the end of the year. And then finally, the Toronto-Windsor corridor. And so if you put all this together, it would look, this is the network that I'm suggesting. Now, I am under no illusions that people are going to say, oh yeah, that sounds great. But it strikes me as being a little strange that we're proposing this nation-building passenger service and we're leaving the Toronto to Windsor corridor entirely off the map. Now, there is some service in that area, but there's the potential for a lot more. And if it's economic development that is being touted as the driving force between for ALTO, how can you ignore this? So I think we need a much broader picture, and I already shared with you earlier that passenger rail is also of interest in Alberta. It's also of interest in Atlantic Canada. We need to step back, I think, and take a closer look at all of this. I also don't want to leave this topic without saying that process matters too. And you folks have seen some pretty unfortunate examples of poor process. But environmental assessment, which apparently is going on now, should have already been done in my view. But it certainly should be done, and before, this goes for everything actually, before any land acquisition starts, read expropriation. A full workup of the business case is required. We haven't seen any of this. And I think it could be done fairly easily on a segment by segment basis because VIA has already some pretty significant data. We know they do on who's using their services now, who's used it in the past, how many people are starting in Toronto and going straight through to Quebec City. From what I've seen, not a lot. So we need to think about this in a slightly different way. Independent master plan oversight, like who's got, from the taxpayer's point of view, who has the oversight for making sure that this all unfolds in a proper way and that there's financial accountability as we go forward with any route and with any improvements to passenger rail. And then the detailed planning that needs to take place, I think also that needs to happen for the Toronto to Montreal and Ottawa corridors before any land acquisition starts. And then finally, the full project plan needs to be developed and put together. So in terms of what I think we should be asking for and working on in the weeks and months ahead, it would be that Premier Ford, first of all, it would be that Premier Ford meets with Prime Minister Carney to ensure that any passenger rail investments align with Ontario's priorities and opportunities, and this needs to start immediately because the widening of the 401, if we want to have that considered as an option, that's already underway. So we need to move forward on that. Secondly, that Minister McKinnon should require ALTO to take a look at alternative options for achieving better rail. Third, that the same minister would require ALTO to develop and cost first mile, last mile solutions for those communities. And by that I mean, where's the station you're connecting to? Or are you building a new one, or what are you doing? That Minister McKinnon should require business cases for all of this work. The minister should also be asking Parks Canada to be a formal part of the environmental assessments and bring their knowledge and expertise to construction of any new services through the area. And then finally, that the Prime Minister, because I think he's the one who's responsible, would put the proper governance and financial management structures in place to ensure that we have independent assessment of the proposals and the in-project financial controls. So I'll pause there. Are there any sort of questions or comments? We'll take a few because I know we've got to move on. But yes?
You mentioned freight, you are focused on and passenger, but you're focusing on Ontario and we're talking about nation building.
Yep.
I think we should be thinking of the whole country, from Halifax to Vancouver, all the way. This should be part of the entire picture. And yes, you can do some projects within that, but what's the freight like going across the prairies? My understanding is that the freight across the prairies is a disaster. Like it's under capacity in terms of the capability, in terms of rail lines, and like if that's what we need to do, put it in place, you know, and that's part of the process. This is just passenger rail is only one small part of the picture.
Yep, and I think Andrew's going to talk more about the freight. So I'm not. I think you'll be better able to answer that question, but it's a very good question. So what's going on with the freight? Any other quick comments and questions?
This is a quick one, but you mentioned working with Ontario Parks, but I'm thinking also there needs to be working with the conservation areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking watersheds, like that's all going to be very significant.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the requirement for environmental assessments was very limited by the High-Speed Rail Network Act embedded in Bill C-15.
Yes. That doesn't mean we can't ask for it.
Well, right. So you asked for, better and more environmental assessment. So notwithstanding, excellent, very good. One other point, which is very important to me, and maybe not so much for the farming community, just by basis of exposure. The Frontenac Arch, the connectivity problem relating to wildlife cannot be mitigated by overpasses. Okay. This is the work of the A2A people, Adirondacks to Algonquin, and they have written and studied that extensively.
I see that.
And if that line goes through there, it will be an environmental disaster of unparalleled proportions this side of the tar sands.
Oh, thank you. And I'm aware of the A2A submission on that front.
No worries, I'll go around. Anybody else?
Anything else? One more?
I'll take the long way around.
Okay.
There you go.
And then we'll move on to give Andrew his due.
No, just talk.
Yeah, I was just thinking that you would also need to have Indigenous involvement in the approval process. I didn't see that.
Sorry, to have who involved?
Indigenous.
Yeah.
And I
think,
just,
that's a good suggestion.
just one other question. In the initial phase, when ALTO came into being, was there a general request for proposals or anything that went out from the federal government, or was it just handed to them to do something in the first place?
I'll ask Lindsay to correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I think she's done a fair amount of research on this, but I think the strategy, do you want to answer that?
On the request for proposals, there was a request for proposal put out, I believe, So concerning the request for proposals, there was a proposal put out by via HFR, probably around in 2023, I believe. And the idea was to build a high-frequency rail and more or less to have the high-speed rail as a reference point. Yeah, how much was high-speed rail? There were 3 proponents chosen to go forward with the RFP, and each of those groups, including Cadence, who won, were paid $20 million each just for their proposal. So, very, very nice work if you can get it. Yeah.
I can tell you that as a result of a direct conversation with an ALTO representative at one of the consultation meetings, when I asked about that issue of high frequency versus high speed, I was told, and I asked twice to make sure I was getting this right, that it was the federal government that told ALTO, or what became ALTO Cadence, to focus just on high speed. To keep both northern and southern routes on the table, but to focus only on high speed. So maybe that person told me incorrectly, but I asked twice to make sure I was getting the right information.
The southern route in this part of the world was an afterthought. It became publicly available, the knowledge of it, that is, while the process was in progress.
Well, I'll just one last comment on that front. I was privileged to be able to sit in on a presentation in 2017 via rail. At the time, the high frequency rail proposal came forward that Andrew referenced. And at that time, it was the northern route. And this was published. So I'm not sharing with you any information that wasn't in the public domain. I think it was published in the Week Standard. They also, at that time, expressed a commitment to improve service on the Lakeshore route, which is the one that we now know of as the Via Service. So there was no southern route proposed at that time, so it showed up in the interim. I'm going to pause now, and Stephen, do you want to come back, or do we just want to move straight to?
No, I'll come back.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, let's stand up, grab a cookie, make a stretch, take a little bit of a break, and then we will come back and carry on. But not too long, 7.5 minutes. Okay, if we can start again. Of course, I'd like to thank Catherine for presenting some other alternatives for us to think about. And these are options that you can mention to your MPP and your MP. They might understand some of them. And that it's something that can be done on a much more economical, much quicker sort of basis. I think probably what we have to do, and I just found this cartoon yesterday, so I'm going to wedge it in here. Rather than developing some kind of foundation for astonishingly extravagant gestures, I think the other one isn't coming up. I think what we really need is an institute for reasonable solutions. And maybe we can propose something like that. Our next speaker and last speaker is Andrew Hyatt. I think he is a geologist and rock mechanics specialist. He has held a research position with Queen's. He has founded a Kingston-based instrumentation company. He's a principal at Citizen Research, an outstanding researcher. He, along with Lindsay Davidson, have been the ones scouring the globe for reasonable research-based alternatives to the ALTO proposal. And I'd like to introduce Andrew. That one.
Okay. Whoops. Thank you, Stephen. I will up a little. I will move quickly through these slides. We will begin populating our beyondalto.ca website, and we'll put this presentation up there together with the video. So please don't hold it against me if I don't just go through the slides in detail. So at the last Tamworth meeting, someone stood up and said, I think we should call this thing High Performance Rail. And so I've stolen that name for what I'm going to talk about here. And as has already been said, the world is not the same as it was 2 years ago. And as Mark Carney says, we take the world as it is, not what we wish it to be. And ALTO is a prosperity era project. We are potentially not in a prosperity era anymore. And our Prime Minister is no longer Justin Trudeau. So, so geopolitics changes, and that can be the cue we need to pivot our railway, just like Mark Carney is pivoting how we think as a country. Carney will sit down with Trump. They will renegotiate CUSMA. And I'm not so sure Donald Trump is going to be particularly frightened by our new high-speed rail line. There's no political case for this railway. There's a weak geopolitical case. And the engineering challenges are real. I've talked previously at various locations about the engineering challenges that we have. And the P3 structure. Are we really going to be able to build this railway? And are these companies going to need bailing out at some stage? And you're going to be bailing them out. As we've already discussed today, these two corporations are not getting along. Basically, they want a divorce. And it's in court on various cases at the moment. And really, I think what we're proposing here today is some way to untangle the CN and the VIA situation. We are like the family members, just as passengers on VIA, just seeing the results of this ugly, toxic relationship. What are the grounds of that divorce? Basically, they want to operate the railway in totally different ways. CN wants to run long trains, 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers if they could, long. 10,000-ton trains. These trains, they want to move slowly. They don't want to have to keep stopping them. That takes a lot of energy. So they don't want to have to change their signaling. It works just fine for these trains trundling along at 40, 50, 60 kilometers an hour. They certainly don't want electrification on the line. So, whereas VIA, nimble trains, accelerate quickly, they would prefer to be electrified. There's an environmental reason for that. And most of all, VIA needs to run to its timetable. You can't do that if you're stuck behind a freight train waiting for a signal. You've only got to look at a North American rail corridor and compare it with a European passenger rail corridor. Double stack containers on the freight rail corridor. This is not going to go well if you try and run that kind of train through an electrified passenger corridor. So fundamentally incompatible. So really, what we've spent the last 10 weeks doing is using probably more powerful tools than anyone's ever had access to before to look at this problem. The world has changed a lot in the last 2 years, and we're taking big advantage of it. And it's really quite shocking. So initially we ran our models to criticize ALTO, to find the problems with the ALTO project, to understand the ALTO project in the context of other projects around the world, and there's many of them, and there's a lot of data in the public domain to do with these projects. But what we've been doing in the last 2 or 3 weeks is turning the models around and saying to the model, if not ALTO, what do you recommend? And the one thing the model really pressed home for us was freight. ALTO is a lot about freight. A lot of the motivation of ALTO has to do with freeing up the CN sub between Pickering Junction and Dorval for freight. There ain't going to be much of a passenger service on the Lakeshore route when this is all said and done. C.D. Howe talk about an optimized passenger service. We all know what optimized will mean. So the model emphasized to us that we need to untangle these two railways. And so there are 2 parts to our proposal. High performance freight rail, and notice that I put that at the top, and high performance passenger rail. And it's the combination of both of those. So we build one and we make one free. We make the freight rail free. And you may say, well, why should we all help CN? Well, CN is 30 years old now, and as a public company. And I know when we first started researching this, we felt Jean Chrétien, he sold one of the crown jewels there to shareholders in 1995, and he created the problem. Well, the real problem was that CN was not a well-run railway in 1995. It had absorbed about $96 billion worth of government investment up to that point in its history. And it was losing about $1.5 billion a year. So if you do the counterfactual on that up to today, if the government had held on to it, that would have been an extra $35 to $50 billion that the government would have had to pay to bail out CN. CN's operating ratio, these rail companies, they work off a key metric called operating ratio. And that's how much does it cost them to operate their railway divided by their total revenue, the money they bring in to run their railway. When CN was privatized, that ratio was 0.85. So for every dollar CN took in revenue, they had to spend 85 cents operating that railway. This is no basis for running a business. That's why they needed to be bailed out to the sum of $1.5 billion a year. Over the first 21, 22 years of their existence, they got that operating ratio down to a best-in-class 57, 58%, or 0.58, 0.57. And as they did that, the railway actually became profitable. And as the railway became profitable, the value of CN increased. It actually had a peak market capitalization of about $80 billion. If you invested $100 in CN in 1995, that today would be worth $6,400. So it's been a success story, privatizing CN. The key thing is that CN owns those lines now. And actually, if you notice, if I go back here, do you notice that that red line is going up slightly recently? Their operating ratio has been deteriorating again. And what do you notice in terms of their market cap? Their market cap's actually been coming down for the last 6 or 7 years. Their shares have been losing value. So CN is under pressure, and the CN sub and the friction on the CN sub is a part of that. CN and VIA aren't getting along, but CN is working with the federal government. The federal government has just built a new container port downstream from Montreal called Constructive. Martin Ambleu, the current CEO of ALTO, was the CEO during that development. So that's all you need to know about understanding CN and ALTO and CN. He brought members of his Constructive team across to ALTO, and we can look at his management team. So Constructive can currently handle 2 container ships. The full build-out looks like it may be up to 6 container ships. And these containers are offloaded, and there's something called rail at the dock. CN Railway goes right to the dock at Constructive. And this is actually a big deal for CN. So if you can imagine, we're going to have a lot of containers coming into Montreal, and if CN can't be sorted out, we might have 5 to 7 1,000 extra trucks each day moving along the 401 corridor. It's already one of the busiest truck highways. And we all know that. We understand the 401 corridor. We drive it along. So CN also tried to build an intermodal hub in Milton. So a lot of goods coming up from the US, coming across the tunnel at Sarnia into the west side of Toronto, and it all needs to be broken up there and distributed to the GTA and to other parts of Ontario. So CN bought some land southeast of Milton, or really south of Milton, in early 2000s. And they wanted to build an intermodal hub there. And the area in blue on that diagram is the area that the town of Milton has zoned for all these logistic warehouses. If you drive the 401 through Milton now, you'll see all these kilometers of these just logistic centers and warehouses. So that CN intermodal is about 10 kilometers away from the area that Milton has chosen next to the 401 for its intermodal zoning. And CN has to move about 1,600 trucks a day through Milton. This ended up at federal court, the Federal Appeals Court, and it ended up at the Supreme Court of Canada, a battle between Milton and CN. And now they're just finally, 24 years later, beginning to build that intermodal hub because they've got the legal clearance that they need. So it's just a mess, yeah. It's poorly planned. We're going to need some intermodal hubs in Eastern Ontario. And we need to make sure these are properly planned. So this really has not been a good situation for the town of Milton or for CN. CP, our other great national railway, well, they were successful in acquiring Kansas City Southern, and the result there is that they now have a lot more lines down in the southern US and in Mexico, and their investment is in nearshoring in Mexico. They're not particularly thinking about Canada. They're a big investor in Mexico. That's not good for anyone here. So CN is our only hope here. In researching the CN stuff, the CP stuff, I thought how beautiful their badge was. I just love that badge. And I just want to make a call out to Heather, because that is an incredible badge that she's created for this group. It truly is beautiful. Passenger. What are we going to do with the passengers? We want to have just freight trains on the existing CN Kingston sub. VIA has the trains. They bought the trains. They might not be perfect, but they bought them. But they don't have any rights at all on the tracks. So can we do something along the 401 corridor is the big question here. And when we ask that question of ALTO now, they say, no, we can't. 300-kilometer railway, you cannot have that railway down the corridor. So we've got to go greenfield somewhere else. David Cook, VP of Systems and Interfaces, stood up at Kingston City Council, and he was asked, why have we ended up with a 300-kilometer-an-hour railway? And his response was, best value for money. It'll cost 25% more to build at 300 versus 200. So I've been doing a lot of work recently, as people have said, in looking at the whole global database of these high-speed rail projects. Yeah. And what you can see in the scatter plot there is how, as we increase the velocity on the y-axis, on the x-axis, as the cost per kilometer increases. David Cook would have us believe that that curve goes flat, almost. It's only 25% more to go 50% increase in speed. It actually goes the other way. So the reason for that, when we do our research, physics. The physics scales between a square and a cube. You don't need to know the details, but it's an exponential relationship with the physics. Secondly, the engineering, the tolerances and the materials that have to be used, all of those are a result of the physics. And that relates to cost, and as we'll see, also carbon as well. All these things follow this exponential relationship. It's just how the engineering of the problem. So it's not surprising that cost does the same thing. So ALTO's claim doesn't really make any sense. Well, and it's not just trains that do this. Cars do the same thing, yeah? So again, you want a car that can go at 300 kilometers an hour, you're going to have to pay a lot more than a Honda Civic. And actually, the scaling is even steeper there because the production figures for those cars. So the idea that it's only 25% more expensive to build this 300 kilometer an hour railway versus 200, it's completely unreasonable. It's misleading. The McLaren 250S on the bottom there, it's many things. It's pretty impressive, but it's not value for money as a transportation device, yeah. Desire, it's desire. That McLaren is desire. But when, again, you look to the world literature on what passengers perceive as value, you get something quite different. The number one tier, the top tier there are reliability. Reliability and punctuality of the service. They want that train to arrive on time. I don't care how long it's going to take, just get there on time. That's what they're saying. Safety, I get that. Another advantage we have in thinking about safety with trains is not just the safety of the train itself, but the safety of not having to drive on the 401. That's a huge consideration for many months of the year here. Second tier are seat availability. That plays to frequency and price. You know, this thing has to be reasonably priced in order to force modal shift. Access. Downtown stations is a tier 2. Stations have to be in downtown. Peterborough's solution to have a greenfield out of town, it's not a good solution. Then let's have a look at tier 3 here. There it is, travel time. It's a tier 3 consideration. It's got about the same weight in this global literature as cleanliness or thermal regulation. So that's what customers value. I personally think the government's been sold a bill of goods by ALTO, if you dive into the literature. Countries that have made a sensible move here, Finland, 220 kilometers an hour, no mega projects, and they're gradually, phase by phase, upgrading their railway. It's a good model for us in similar climatic conditions. Sweden tried to build a high-speed rail line, the East Link, 320 kilometers an hour, got partway through, 50% budget overrun, and bailed, now running at 250. Focusing on just upgrading and maintaining what they have. So what about our a high-performance passenger rail. Let's build this thing down the 401. ALTO would have you believe that the 401 corridor is foreclosed, that we can't build a railway down the 401. We can build a 200-kilometer-an-hour railway along the 401 corridor. That's the result of the research we've been doing and the models we've been running over the last number of weeks. 300 kilometer? Let's create a new passenger railway, and it is better to be a passenger railway if you're going to run it close to the 401 because the severance is already done. It was done in the 1970s, 60s, 70s when the 401 was built. Trying to create a passenger railway along the freight railway, there's a lot of agricultural crossings there. Ted pointed this out to me, and I went, and you can see on Google Earth, every few hundred meters, there's some guy that is going across the railway with his combine or something, yeah? You see him, you see his tracks coming there, and he goes across the railway. The 401, there's no combines crossing the 401, yeah? So it ends up, I thought 3 weeks ago, let's run a freight rail down the 401. That's not a good idea. Yeah, so I had to onboard what I've stolen many of these ideas from Sandra and Ted and what other people have put in here. Let's use the Kingston sub just for short distances to get us into our towns, yeah? And maybe Cornwall, Brockville, Kingston, Belleville, and Coburg. Spread them out, yeah?
Exactly what
Ottawa is served by the existing Alex sub and Smiths Falls sub. VIA owns the lines up to Ottawa. The on-time performance of those lines is above 90%. VIA runs well when there's no freight on the line, or at least they have priority. And why do I want to build this new passenger railway along the 401? Because that's what the government wants to do. It wants to spend money. It wants to stimulate the economy. Travel times, I'm not going to get into the details here, but 3 hours, 38 minutes from Toronto to Montreal. And that's the key pair in all of this. So ALTO, 3 hours. Currently, 4.5, 5 hours. You can run express trains where you pretty much don't stop at maybe anywhere, maybe just Kingston. Or you can run more regional trains. 38 minutes, and to save 38 minutes is probably, I would almost bet it might be $100 billion difference to save 38 minutes. Can you drive modal shift? In the UK, the East Coast Main Line's a great example of this. London King's Cross, Edinburgh Waverley. It takes 4 hours, 10 minutes to go between those two locations, and both are downtown in the middle of the city stations. And 54% of people taking that route travel by rail. It outcompetes air even at a 4-hour travel time. So you can drive modal shift. 401 co-construction we've talked about. Let's get the province and the feds working together on this for a coordinated project. Our models are estimating there's a savings of 4 to 8 billion in construction that can be realized if we can build this project together. It's a big project. It's a project for the 21st century here. There's another, and what I've done as well is I've had our models look along the 401 to see how we can follow the actual highway itself We'll be off to the northern edge of the highway, but can we follow the highway? ALTO, 7-kilometer turning radius, because it's going at 300, yeah? It's no good. We can only follow that highway for about 50, 60%. Whereas if we use 200 kilometer an hour, if we use non-tilting cranes, we're up to above 80%, 85%. And if we use tilting technology like they have in Finland, then we can be close to 90%, and we don't have to deviate as far away from the highway at all. So I take Doug Ford at his word. Is he serious about using the 401 highway? There's another point here, and I think I lost the slide. It's the idea of foreclosure. We can get our models to say, what's the cost of not using the 401 highway? Because once that highway gets widened, and once it begins to infill even more, it's going to become even more expensive in the future if we ever want to do anything. The corridor can become what's called fossilized. You can't do a damn thing now. The models predict that by 2050, if you wanted to build this railway down, some railway down the corridor in 2050, it would cost $43 billion in addition to what it would cost today. So that's your cost of not doing this now. The ALTO routes, they won't foreclose. You think a route through here is going to foreclose because there's too much development? No. Along Highway 7, that's not going to foreclose. So the same arguments don't hold for ALTO. So details of the railway. We have two linear pieces of infrastructure, the Highway 401 and CN's Kingston sub. And we need to be clever. We need to use both of those pieces of infrastructure if we can. Here's Belleville. CN sub there is the blue dashed line, and Highway 401 you can see, and the passenger rail is the gold line. And so a passenger rail from the east would come along the 401, come down, follow the Kingston sub through Belleville, and then we'll be polite to CN. We'll get off as quickly as we can, but we want to access that downtown. We've already got 3 lines between Napanee and Belleville, and 4 lines through Belleville itself. We may have to upgrade the station and the platforms, but we can do it. Same with Cornwall. We got the CN Kingston sub running there. We come off the 401, we can get onto the CN sub. We are going to have to expropriate a little bit of land to make these crossovers. But we're being sympathetic, and we're being reasonable in terms of how much land. We're trying to minimize the amount of land that we have to expropriate and the amount of severance that we have to do. We've got to get across the 416 at Prescott, but again, there's various options. And did I? Oh, can I go back? Yeah, there's Kingston. Kingston's actually quite tricky, yeah? In terms of if you want to, but who knows, and it's not my job to do this, but you could come across at Kingston Mills there, east of Kingston, loop along the Cataraqui River there, maybe have a new station somewhere close to the bridge crossing here. This is the new bridge crossing in Kingston. Have a station here and get back onto the 401 as quickly as you can. You don't want to follow that Kingston sub down the lake. It goes down closer to the lake between Kingston and Napanee. Yeah, and then you know that 401 stretch from Kingston to Napanee, it's pretty straight. 416, yes, there are bends in the 401. I get it. There's bends, but there's often options to use the Kingston sub and to bring the railway there. Intersections, 401 will be built to an 8-lane spec now. It'll only have 6 lanes, but it will be built to 8-lane. The intersections are going to have to be reworked, and so the idea is that you can combine this groundwork together and have this railway running more or less collinear. And yes, you will need to expropriate some land, but from a kind of resistance and community friction point of view, it's much easier to expropriate that land close to the 401. You don't have the same severance problems due to farmland than it is to carve through greenfield. I'll actually be talking at a Safe South Frontenac event on Wednesday, and there I'm really going to talk about the cost of community friction in building a high-speed rail. It's probably at least as big a problem in terms of cost as the engineering challenges. Oh, there's the foreclosure. So about 43 billion if you don't build this rail down the corridor now. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy here. Is it totally frozen?
Nope. There you go.
Yeah.
Not sure
As I said before, physics, engineering, cost, carbon. There's certain relations between these. They're exponential relationships. This project, and there's a western segment to it, in total is about a third of the price of what ALTO are saying is the lower range for. And ALTO has a benefit cost ratio of 0.4. That's a big problem. Yeah. If we look at the carbon budget, and Stephen and I did a lot of work on this, this project pays back its carbon debt in about 11 years. And again, it's generating close to 4 million tons to build, but it's paying that back in 11 years. Stephen and I, and my own work with ALTO, with reasonable numbers of passengers. So our parametric study showed 4, 8, and 12 million. We're not talking 24 million. That is just not realistic. ALTO sent in the center there 100 years to pay back its 15 million tons, if we get reasonable. Why do ALTO need 24 million passengers? They need 24 million passengers to make it all work. They didn't start with 24 million passengers. They did all the engineering, or back of the envelope at least, and said, we need 24 million passengers to make this work from a financial or a carbon. And those two are related. Yeah. So we've got a golden opportunity here. Yeah. There's an appetite to build something. Let's not go cheap. And we have some co-construction opportunity. Yeah, that's okay. I'm not going to go into the detail. And the other thing, and again, I'm going to talk about this on Wednesday. This ALTO project needs to obtain a social license. And to this stage, it's been horrible. Yeah? That social license can, even if none of you here are going to use a new passenger rail, freeing up that Kingston sub will get trucks off the 401. That gives you some benefit. We have the environmental side of things. Hopefully we can co-mitigate across the widened 401 and the new railway. Yeah? You don't want some moose, like there was a moose wandering around at Chafee's Lock, the pictures of it. You don't want that guy coming south or whatever. He gets across the 401 somehow, and then he dies crossing the railway. You know, we're going to have two big barriers across the landscape. So if we can combine the mitigation for both of those, that's good. And there's other issues like severance here. And another big one is benefits along the corridor. We will get on board this project. We'll have some disruption along the 401 and all of that. But if we can all have some benefit from it, then we're going to be much more positive towards any project. And I think as time goes by, there's a number of things we'll ask for. So I've finished. That's good. Thank you.
So we'll have our questions.
Kathy, you come up. You answered some questions too.
I'm just wondering, you guys have done an immense amount of work, which is really appreciated. Is this the only organization along the projected route that is happening, or are you guys linking with other organizations as well?
Give that to Heather.
Yeah, give that to Heather.
I'm answering this? Okay. Am I mentioning other acronyms into the mix here? So there is another organization that's sort of local to us. It's the only other group, I believe, that's at least sort of publicly talking about alternatives to ALTO, and that is the Corridor Train Alliance. My understanding is, you know, members of this coalition have tried to reach out to them, engage with them. They were invited to speak today. They aren't really in alignment with a lot of the messaging here. They're sort of following, from what I understand, and hopefully they will host events or provide more information. They're sort of sticking a bit more to the ALTO script. They're focusing on a high-speed rail project, as is the mandate from the federal government and the project that ALTO was commissioned to build. And they're sort of asking ALTO to reconsider options within the metric or the framework of still sticking to that high-speed rail type of project. So I guess clearly, as you can see from watching, you know, the presenters today, this thought process is taking it outside of a high-speed rail framework and into something kind of quite different. So it would seem that for now anyway, the two groups are, I mean, I think we're all aligned in opposing the project as it currently stands, but there's a divergence in the direction that individuals may or groups may want to go in terms of pressing the government and ALTO to consider other options. Does that sound like it covered it?
That's good.
If I may, I'd like to add in response to your question, because it's one thing to build relationships with other organizations so that we share common messaging and so on. But there are a lot of other Facebook groups, there are a lot of other organizations, and I know Sandra's made contact with some that would probably really like to hear what our research has generated, and they can make the choice of whether they want to join in with that or not. But I think we have an opportunity to share this information with a lot of other communities across the corridor.
So on the topic of sharing, this is wonderful, and I much appreciate your work. So how does this get to the Ministry of Transportation? How does this get to the ear of government?
Well, there's a couple of ways
Sandra.
that can happen. One is that both Andrew and I have tens of pages of additional documentation supporting the presentations that we've made. And that can reasonably easily be put into a form that we could share with the Ministry of Transportation, the Premier of Ontario, the Prime Minister, McKinnon and so on. And I just ask you to keep in mind that the parliamentary assistant to the Ontario Ministry of Transportation is actually an area MPP. And now that we have the Canada-Ontario partnership to build, that seems to be a fairly straightforward process to get that into the Ministry of Transportation for consideration. And I certainly, because of the Premier's comments about preferring the 401 corridor and wanting additional stops, I think we send it to the Premier's office as well, or hand deliver it.
There's also a role for you here. And you should be demanding that your elected representatives look at alternatives, or it doesn't matter how much data we send them, they're not going to pay attention.
Can I suggest with Rick Brise being, that's who you're talking about, being the MPP, who's the, is he the assistant to, in transportation for the provincial government?
Yes, he's parliamentary assistant.
I think it would be that's a perfect place to have a letter writing phone campaign that we specifically ask, suggest, demand that they look at this very fine alternative propositions here and arrange, see if we can arrange a meeting with Rick Brise. I think that should happen almost immediately. We have a lot of people on our websites, and I think in a very pleasant way, we make a very strong approach through all of the ways we have access: telephone, letter writing, email. Let's do it. And I think if a proposition came across our website that we could all sign to.
Can I just also add to that MPP and parliamentary assistant Brise has come out on behalf of his constituency. He has made it clear that he is not in favor of the ALTO proposal in its current form. So I think we might have a...
That's perfect, isn't it?
I just wanted to add, because I have one random brain cell that sometimes catches up to what I've been saying. And I know we're talking more about the Ontario situation, but just going back to that question about other groups, I do know that there are some in Quebec that are forming. I have an awareness of a group that's out that way that's really heavily focused on monorail as a solution to what they're seeing as issues with the ALTO high-speed rail. So I wanted to mention that as well, that there is there's other groups out there that are forming, trying to come up with alternatives.
Thanks. Again, also, I really appreciate all the work and really critical thinking, alternative thinking behind what you're presenting now. So I guess two questions. One is, I feel like this really needs to get into a national dialogue, and questions about taxpayer money, but also about how we can electrify the economy and help support a alternative that reduces greenhouse gases and helps reduce cars, all of that, that's tied in. So my question is, how can or have you thought about press coverage, media coverage, and how do we get this expanded even past Ontario and Quebec, because it is a national issue. Thanks.
So it may not be my, Stephen, you may want to speak to this, but aren't we recording this?
Oh, yes, we are. Go ahead. No. All those issues matter. And one of the difficulties that we face is that there are so many of them that sometimes we feel overwhelmed and we don't know exactly what to look at. And I think our best bet is to hit the curveballs as they come in. For instance, right now it's ALTO until something else is done about it, and chip away at the other issues as we can. And bringing them in our arguments, but I think we have to be more specific and more targeted in terms of the proposals that we think are particularly flawed.
I'm just going to say, we haven't seen the details, any engineering details from ALTO at all. We don't know how they're going to build this railway. But there are certain situations where they try and pull the wool over our eyes and just say, the 401 corridor is no good, it's foreclosed, we can't do anything there. Or we have to get to Montreal from Toronto in 3 hours. That's the key consideration here. I don't know, I think part of this is just enlightening some of the politicians. I know I shouldn't say this, and I'm going to get in big trouble here, but how bright is McKinnon? I think that's an issue. Yeah.
I just have a question over here with the mic right now. Sorry.
So yeah, I just a quick question. First of all, like everybody's been saying, thanks so much for all of your work, and it's really standing up for our community. So thank you so much. One question that I have, and kind of a real a place of political weakness that I don't think we're talking about near enough, is the relationship between SNC-Lavalin and also known as Atkins Realis. I think if most people understood that a company that in its relationship to the Canadian government in terms of its huge corruption scandals and over-involvement with lobbying, on top of that, it's building a train system, the LRT system, that every day you turn on the radio, another train has started on fire. Not actually, but it's a broken system. So I relate it to, it's asking a contractor who's built a subdivision, and they've done a poor job of it, to be then ask them to build a skyscraper. So I guess that's my question to you all is, and maybe this is something that you'll touch on more, is that relationship between SNC-Lavalin and this project.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. When I began working on this 10 weeks, 11 weeks ago, it was mostly just about the geology. I did a little bit of work on the northern route versus southern route, and I was very much just, I think it's less expensive to build across the northern route. As we've researched more, I've come to understand, as I peel away at the onion, that there's something not quite right here. Yeah, and whether it's a way for the government to funnel money to Air Canada or to funnel money to SNC, what dynamics are at place between the federal government, and is it some kind of Quebec separatist driving thing or shield against that? I don't understand, based on our research, the motivation for this project. That's based on the engineering and the construction technology, the pricing, the carbon. So there's something going on.
Okay, another question here.
May I just add a couple of points? Because just following what Andrew's been saying, that is one example of the rationale for my recommending that we need an independent capability at the federal level. Actually, not just for the ALTO project, but for all the major projects, that would have somebody who's independent to be able to assess the proposals and look after the financial control on this. And if you have a smartphone with you and you can get a signal, just Google the Norwegian QA infrastructure process, because there are models for this that a lot of other countries are using. As far as I can tell, We don't have that in Canada at this moment. The other thing I just want to add is that it's my understanding of what happens at the federal level. If it's the same as what happens at the provincial level, every time a minister is appointed, he or she receives the equivalent of what we'll call a mandate letter. I know that's what it is called provincially. And in that, the Prime Minister says, Minister X, here is your assignment for the next period of time. So keep in mind that the ALTO proposal, the high-speed rail, is a project that was born in a previous government that has now been moved forward into the current federal government. But I'm guessing that at least to this point, the mandate letter has not changed. So that's a question we would need to ask. So Minister McKinnon is obligated to carry on with that project until his mandate letter is changed.
Hello. This question's for Andrew. The last time you were here, you did a terrific talk on geology and the northern route versus the southern route, and you talked specifically about karst topography and how the fractured bedrock in this southern route would not really support high-speed rail because it's fracturing and it could result in the track changing and derailing and whatever. I'm just curious now why you've changed and are now supporting a rail going through the 401 corridor, which in this area is running over karst topography.
As I researched the geological side of the problem more and more, I did fully come to understand how sensitive the karst environment is. It's a rare environment, and water gets into that karst environment very quickly. There are recharge zones around that karst environment where the aquifers really do have high recharge from. Let's be honest, the 401, a lot of salt used on the 401. There's disturbance to do with the 401. But I would prefer to run this railway, if we can, along that corridor. The drainage systems there are going to work for both pieces of infrastructure. So I would prefer to use both pieces of infrastructure, and I get it. We can't fully mitigate. I know. I see the karst as I drive along the 401. I'm very aware of that. Yeah. But I just have the feeling that something's going to happen here. And I certainly, it's the same. I mean, I was promoting the Highway 7 route early on. That's not without environmental problems as well. The railway has to go somewhere if the government are hell-bent on building it. So I just feel that, and again, Susan knows more about the sensitivity to de-icing and things like that. I just feel that it's better to co-locate the two major pieces of infrastructure together and to spend proper money on mitigation there, yeah. We can't do nothing. That's just, it's just not an option, yeah.
Your own comment earlier, the southern and northern routes, if you like, 7, are 300 kilometer per hour service, which requires extreme quality control on the track work. 200 kilometer per hour is a significantly wider tolerance band. So that also helps as well. Just a comment.
Yeah, Peter, who made that comment there, was referred to me and Peter has a lot of experience. He is a railway engineer, which I am not. So, and I spoke at length with Peter on the telephone, and I think he is concerned about building a 300-kilometre-an-hour railway in our climatic conditions. So.
Just want to thank you for all that good hard work again. Could you comment on the significance of a cost-benefit analysis in the decision-making process? And perhaps, is it true that ALTO has yet to produce one? And I thought that maybe you had mentioned one in relation to your proposal.
You did the point 4?
Yeah, the point. Where does the point? Is it from the tram report?
Well, no, but I think what Dave is asking you about is your point 4.
So, I believe point 4 comes either from the C.D. Howe report or an original tram report. Sort of some of the documents that were, but both of those reports, or certainly the tram report, predicted that by I believe by 2050 that the ridership would be around 10 million, 10, 11 million, in that kind of range. And that cost to benefit ratio obviously is highly sensitive to the number of passengers that are riding the railway. So it kind of makes sense, because 10 million, 0.4. 24 million, at least a cost benefit of a benefit cost ratio of 1. Yeah. So you see, you begin to understand where the 24 million riders that they need to have a benefit cost ratio of greater than 1. The fact of the matter is, this is costing a lot of money to build initially. And Minister McKinnon said another slightly strange thing in an interview on CTV. He talked about, we haven't seen the details of the P3, so Cadence will build this railway. So who will operate the railway? Because in many European countries, such as the UK, such as Spain, the government kind of subsidizes the railway infrastructure. Network Rail is subsidised to the sum of about £11 billion per year in the UK. It's a big sum of money. And then operators operate the trains and do all of that. And they can make profits just operating the trains. Yeah, they can lease the trains, and then they can run them. And they end up, and someone was on Cross Country Checkup last week saying South Korean high-speed rail super profitable. Well, the operators there don't have to pay for the maintenance of the infrastructure. Yeah. So how is, and you want multiple operators because you want competition. The secret on Madrid to Barcelona has been French operators coming in with very low prices and driving the prices down, getting more people onto the railway. Yeah, and that really is the big success story that we often hear that the ALTO execs are focused on is Madrid-Barcelona. And the Spanish build their high-speed railways very cost efficiently too. And again, I'm going to talk on Wednesday about why. So you want people to ride these railways, but the prices need to be low, and you need competition. And one of the big competitors that can drive down prices, and we see this in Europe, are airlines. Airlines competing with high-speed rail help bring the price down of everything. Do you see a problem? Air Canada, Cadence? That's one of the main mechanisms that should be driving the price down. At least Porter Airlines will be working out of Billy Bishop Airport and helping drive prices down. Yeah.
Yeah, I got something. The more and more I get to listen to these programs, I've heard you guys a few times now, and I did on Facebook, of course. There are more and more projects that has been abandoned here. Maribel Airport, Pickering Airport. We had a turbo train that got abandoned. So rather than spending that $90 billion on another failure, I think it's best to spend it on Via Rail, set them on their own tracks, where the tracks are. We're all happy that everybody in the country can use it. This fast train, it only stops at certain places which nobody can afford to buy the ticket. So, and the one in China, from what I heard, is still not making any money. And how long have they had that?
In China, they don't need to.
So, China State Railways, do you know what their current debt load is?
No idea.
It's almost as big as Canada's. $890 billion US. And that's the cost of making the railway affordable to ride in China.
That's fucking stuck up there.
So may I take it from your observation, which I think we would concur with, that you are more supportive of the kinds of presentations that Andrew and I've made today as opposed to the current ALTO plan?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody? Susan, did you want to?
This is just to address the karst question that was brought up. And I think two things that I think it's easy to agree with the fact that that Ontario definitely needs a more usable railway that's beneficial for everyone. And I think it makes a lot of sense to put it in the same area where we already have damage, or where we already have development. So in the areas of like the 401 and the current rail lines, because we've already made a big divide there anyway. And so this simply adds on some miles to that, original line. And the other thing about karst terrain is, with ALTO's plan of using a 300 kilometer an hour train, that requires an extremely stable ground underneath it, and a lot of work has to go into making that ground really stable, including in karst where there are many holes underneath it, filling all that in with concrete. So a huge amount of damage to be done there. Whereas if at least we're going with a lower speed train, let's say 160 to 200K, that's not, the requirements are not quite so rigid. So I'm assuming that, right, there would be less damage even to karst terrain than there would have been with the faster train speed. I know neither one's perfect, but I think we have to consider what are the benefits for everybody.
I'm just going to repeat that just very briefly, that the question is asking about VIA's input with regards to this project and the effects that it could have on VIA.
Well, just a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that in 2024, VIA published, what was it called, VIA Action 2030, which laid out what their strategic plan would be to improve VIA services, including, in their words, becoming a best-in-class operator. passenger rail services. But also keep in mind that their mandate is set by the federal government. They don't get to determine that. So I think we can see that somewhere between the publication of the Via Rail Action Plan or Strategic Plan in 2024 and today, somebody made a fairly big change.
And I just want to add too, just to kind of connect the dots moment, that VIA is not involved in this because ALTO is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of VIA. That doesn't mean that VIA owns ALTO, but it still places VIA just a notch above ALTO in terms of the structure of those corporations. And so again, your question is very interesting because VIA is very much in the mix here. VIA is highly aware of ALTO, given that VIA stands above ALTO as a wholly owned subsidiary of its corporation. And so the fact they're not really saying anything about it is curious indeed. I'm running to you, Lindsay. I'm running.
Yeah.
I can yell. My understanding is that Transport Canada is plans to transfer over the operations on the Kingston sub to Cadence in the future. So again, it's a weird structure. VIA and ALTO are two separate Crown corporations. Cadence is not ALTO. Cadence is a consortium that has been given the contract to basically design and develop this new railway, and then the federal government will have to make the funding decision for the final railway. That's the $60 to $90 billion. One presumes that Cadence will get that. I don't know if they are the ones that have developed it, but that's a decision that hasn't been made. But somewhere in the Transport Canada documentation that you can Google around and find online, it's like a Treasury Board memo or something like that, they talk about the operation of the sub going over to Cadence. So if you have this private consortium running it, and it's, you know, maybe not as profitable now because the travel from Toronto to Montreal has gone over to ALTO, you can see. And I found in the CD Howe report, very interesting, and Andrew mentioned this, that they talk about in the future optimizing the travel along the Kingston sub, which to me is code for reducing it. And in fact, VIA tried to do that about 2 years ago. They were going to drop a whole bunch of trains. In fact, some of them, the Payne train I used to take to Toronto at 5:30 a.m. doesn't run anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. But anyway, so I think there is a very significant risk here. But remember, VIA and ALTO, and they're all part of the government. They're going to do whatever the federal government wants. Cadence is supposed to at least cover certain amount of operating costs and things. Right now, we believe Cadence is a DBOM, a design, build, operation, management contract. But again, the final decision hasn't been funded by the government, if that makes any sense at all. Anyway.
Well, it does. Hopefully, if the question were able to be answered by the federal government or ALTO, hopefully it would make more sense. But if you go back to February of 2025, when former Prime Minister Trudeau announced the ALTO project, it was very clear at that time that the consortium and ALTO would be actually operating what we now think of as the Lakeshore route. However, when Minister McKinnon was interviewed by CTV on, I believe it was the 26th of March, it sounded more like the operations were going to be put out for tender, and I think his phrase was, and the lowest cost provider would be selected. So who knows what the actual answer to that question is.
Okay, I will we're in the final furlong here. I will just quickly reiterate what I talked about before, that democracy doesn't always happen at elections. We really I sense that there is an appetite in this room to take some action, and that is what we really need. We would thank you in advance for that. And I just want to point out again, on the table back there, there is a handout, a half-page handout, which gives you a number of websites to go to gather information and maybe to clarify your thoughts. One in particular that I want to point out is Lindsay and Andrew's website /advocacy, and it's on the list, so you don't have to remember that. But there are very simple, plain language reasons why we really have to look at alternatives other than the current ALTO alternative. And another section that is specifically for Ontario, why ALTO is not a particularly good deal for Ontario. And that is really what you can use to put your own ideas and to apply whatever political pressure you can. I think sometimes we might be a little reluctant, but I believe that the prerequisite for social change is the willingness to make a fuss. And if we don't do that, then nothing is going to change. One of my heroes is a fellow named Big Jim Larkin, who was a trade union organizer in Ireland in the late 19th, early 20th century. If you've been to Dublin, there's a really nice statue to him. Anyway, the story goes that the police came one time to break up one of his speeches, and he talked the police into forming a union. One of his favorite quotations is, "The rich and powerful only seem above us because we are on our knees. Let us rise." And the times, they are a-changing. I mean, the polls show us that the attitudes toward high-speed rail have really significantly changed. In 2009, 80% support in Canada. In 2025, it dropped down to 76% support in Quebec and 71% in Ontario. June 2025, it's dropped just a little bit more yet, down to 70%. And the latest one, March 2006, 25% of Canadians support this project. And now that's partly because people understand more about it, partly because there are groups trying to spread the word, and partly because there are people like you who are asking questions. So I ask you to continue to ask those questions. This is a map that Save South Frontenac put together about the opposition to this project, and I'll leave this on the screen. You can come up and take a look at it because you won't be able to see it from there. But we're not alone. There are lots of other people who are trying to develop science research-based alternatives to improving better rail in Ontario. So we can take some benefit from that. Sandra Cowan wants to say something.
So I just wanted to make it's insignificant in comparison to what we've heard, but I had an idea last week about the number of people who've signed the petition, Scott Reed online petition opposing ALTO. And I thought of the old chain letter, which I never sent on and I never did a thing about. But if everybody, this is what I did last week. I called 10 people who I'd already talked to about ALTO. I asked each of them to call 10 people they knew and send that petition online. And if they thought it appropriate, send the Citizens Research Initiative as well if they wanted more information. And then if that kept on going, the numbers of 13,766, 13,000, we should be able to do much better than that. That is not a significant number of people. Many more than that oppose ALTO. So I just ask each of you to consider that, sending it around, getting people to send it around, and we'll reach everyone if we do that. So, and thanks so much for the presentation. Brilliant.
I had a little exit speech, but I'm not going to bother now because we've gone way beyond the itinerary timelines. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things. I did misspeak earlier, and I was reading a typo in my own speech, so that's probably why it's better for me to just free talk. The consultation is not closed yet. It closes on the 24th, so we have 5 more days. So I really encourage everybody, if there's anybody here in this group that hasn't pinned the map yet or engaged with the ALTO website, please do so. This is our last week. If you struggle with it at all, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can find me on the Facebook group. You can find me on Facebook. Just look for my name, Heather Levy. You can find us through the website, savestonemills.ca. Let's get as much information onto the ALTO site and maps as we can this week. It's our last few days. Who knows, maybe they're going to extend it again. I don't know what's happening. We can't predict what ALTO's going to do. The other thing I just wanted to shout out, and I know a lot of people have already grabbed them, there's letters at the back. We've sort of cherry-picked a few MPs and the Premier of Ontario for a letter writing campaign. So there's letters and pre-addressed envelopes. I had a bunch of stamped envelopes for the Premier's office, but I ran out of stamps, so I don't know if you do happen to find that envelope to the Premier without a stamp. It does require postage, but the federal ones do not. You can just put the letters, fill it out, add a few lines of your own personal words if you want, put your name and your contact information, so on it, and put it in the mail. We do want to see the politicians get flooded with our concerns. Emails are great. Paper mail is amazing. You know, there's lots of people with these dreams of MPs walking into their offices and not being able to find their desk because of all the letters. It's not how it works, we know, but it's impactful to see a lot of paper mail. If you want to take some of that paper mail, a few extras to give to your neighbors, friends, anybody who's not here today or not on the internet much, go ahead. And a little initiative just building on what Sandra was saying with the chain letters. The signs, which are a wonderful thing that we're seeing more and more of. There's signs at the back as well for sale. I know a few people in our group, what they have done is they've taken some copies of those letters, and if they see somebody with a sign out in their yard, well, then they go and knock on the door and say, hey, I have some copies of letters if you're interested in mailing MPs or the Premier your opposition to the ALTO project. And you know, it's a lot better than just sort of a cold door knock, because if they've got the ALTO sign, then chances are they may be on board with taking that initiative, right? Other than that, thanks for coming out, and thank you so very much to everybody that spoke and gave these amazing presentations today.
And a final thanks to Don Joyce for doing the YouTube live feed. Thank you very much, Don.